and welcome to another episode of A Gentle Calvinist, the show whose title is for the host and not necessarily for the listener, to remind myself to defend Reformed theology with gentleness and respect for those who disagree with it. My name's Dave Lewis, and today we're going to tackle a topic that I am by no means an expert in, but I think is out there and very confusing to people, and that is the concept of Molinism, the concept of middle knowledge, and the most popular proponent of it, Dr. William Lane Craig. So I'm going to take a stab at this. Any Molinists who stumble upon this video and want to comment on it, you're more than welcome to engage with me. I'd love to engage with you on this topic, just to try to understand Molinism. And the way I'm going to go about that is I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to look at a video that William Lane Craig put out in his Reasonable Faith. This came out a couple days ago. I think he's at a conference or some kind of event he's doing, and the question is, why did God create people he knew would reject him? Now, this is a very potent and powerful objection and question that an Arminian, non-Calvinist, synergistic system has to answer. Because remember, a lot of times Calvinists are the ones who are seen as the only ones that have the problem with the idea that God created individuals that are predestined for hell. And God, because he's sovereign and governs the universe by a decree, that's the only system. We're the only ones, us poor Calvinists, who have to defend the idea that God created a universe where people would go to hell. And how horrible is that? He's such a tyrant. He has to give everyone a chance, etc., etc. But really, if you think about it at a deeper level, any system in which there is foreknowledge has to tackle the idea that why would God create a universe that he knew there would be people who would go to hell in it. So that's very important. I have a really hard time getting people who are committed to synergism, non-Calvinism, Arminianism, provisionism, whatever you want to call it, to see that. It's very difficult for that light bulb to go off. But once that light bulb goes off, it's really, really interesting. That's what happened to me in my journey toward Reformed theology. Is I couldn't really answer that question. I couldn't see the consistency of it. But anyway, let's just jump right in here. Let's see what Dr. Craig says here, and I'll try to explain, because this is a very brief clip, and of course I'll get accused of taking him out of context, and I need to listen to everything. And this is part of the problem with people who hold to middle knowledge and Molinism. They always go back to, well, you need to understand the complexity of this system and the philosophy of it, and you lack understanding. You need to study for 150 hours, and you need to watch and read everything William Lane Craig has put out, and you need to really understand the philosophy. So I'm trying to simplify it here, because that's the objection you'll get is, well, if you understood it more, you would get it. You just don't get it. Well, okay, fair enough. And, if I will admit that I don't have understanding of it, but this isn't so much for those of you who are committed to Molinism already. Of course, I hope that you see that it's causes more problems than solutions. But, and there's plenty of material out there on Molinism and what it is if you want to do the research. But let's just see what he says and try to break it down.
Two things. Number one, it may not be feasible for God to create a world in which everyone freely embraces salvation and comes to him. It's logically impossible to make people.
Okay, hold on. Okay, so when this is my understanding, when he says it's not feasible for God to make a world in which everyone accepts him. So in Molinism, God, before he creates or actuates is a word they use, but before he creates the universe that we live in, this is the one he actuated. But God is like a supercomputer. Just an analogy, I know it's crude, but God looked and saw every possible world he could create with all the possible circumstances that he could put free creatures in. and found the world that he actuates. So he had all these possible worlds he could create. That's the language we hear from a Molinist. The possible worlds that God could create, and there's literally unlimited amounts of these, trillions upon trillions, quadrillions. You can't even quantify the number, but God could see all the possible universes he could create, all the situations he could put free creatures in to maximize. And this is what God's doing in the system of Molinism. His foreknowledge functions as, they call it, middle knowledge. God sees all the possible worlds he could create and creates the one that's most feasible to whatever his intentions are. Now, of course, God's intention is to save as many people as possible. He'll quote 1 Timothy 2:4 and 2 Peter 3:9. He wants all people to be saved. But in Molinism, as in everything else that isn't a reformed system, God is limited in what he can do because of the freedom and free will of creatures. So just like in every other system, what is the one thing that prevents God from saving everyone? It's this force, this law, this principle that exists outside of his creative decree called free will. So in Dr. Craig's opinion, well, why can't God create a world where no one rejects him? Well, he can't do that because it's not feasible. In other words, it's not possible. In other words, God's not able to do that. Okay, so let's continue.
Do something freely. So it may sound
Wait, let me go back.
comes to him. It's logically impossible to make people do something freely.
So it's logically impossible to make people do something freely. So from a logical perspective, in Dr. Craig's mind, making somebody do something freely is a logical impossibility. Okay.
So it may sadly be the case that in any world of free creatures, there will always be some who will freely reject God in his every effort to save them.
Why? So there is no world that God can create where there won't be some people who will freely reject him. Why? Why? Well, because in Molinism, there is some principle, some law, some situation that God has to do business with or deal with apart from his decree, apart from his power. In this system, God cannot create a universe where all people will be saved. Cannot. He's not able to do so.
But I take seriously the scriptures that say God wants all persons to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth, that God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. So his plan and his will is universal salvation, and he works toward that end. And the fact that universal salvation is not achieved is only because people freely repudiate God in his every effort to save them. And it may be that there is no world of universal salvation, of free creatures that's available to God. The other
Whoa. Let's hear that again, because this is really the nub of it. Let's go back.
repudiate God in his every effort to save them. And it may be that there is no world of universal salvation, of free creatures that's available to God.
There's no world of universal salvation for free creatures that's available to God. So in this system, Molinism, middle knowledge, only certain universes are available for God to actuate. In other words, God looks, using his foreknowledge, of all the possible worlds he creates, and he actually cannot create a world where all people would be saved. That option is not available to him. Now, this is one of the biggest problems with this system. So you mean to tell me that God's sovereignty and his omnipotence and his glory is the triune God who existed from all eternity before there was time, space, and matter? He is the only being in existence. There's nothing else in existence besides him. His hands are tied and he is limited in what universe he can bring about. So he can't bring about a universe. There's a quote from Dr. Craig that's taken, that they say is taken out of context, where he says that basically God can only use the cards he's been dealt. And that's the context he's talking about, of can God create a world where everybody would be saved? And he's just saying absolutely not. I mean, this system is much more definitive about limiting the power of God than Arminianism and non-Calvinism has ever dreamed about being. In this system, God is 100% limited in what he's able to do as the creator of the universe. He cannot, because that option is not presented to him, because of this principle, this law, this force that exists outside or next to God. The idea of free will, and the idea of he can't create a universe. It's not feasible. Now then he gives a little example of what does he mean by feasibility? So what is he talking about there when God sees all the possible universes? So even if there is a possible universe it exists in God's mind, remember, he's like a supercomputer who can run all the scenarios. He's like an AI system that can run every possible scenario that would happen in every possible universe he could create. And even if there is a universe where everyone is saved, he doesn't create that universe because it's not feasible. Here's what he means by that.
The other thing is that it may be that if there are worlds of universal salvation, that they have overriding deficiencies that make them less preferable. And one that I thought of, for example, would be maybe they've only got 2 or 3 people in them. And if he were to create any more, then at least one of them would reject God. And that would seem to be a pretty deficient world. It seems to me that so long as God gives sufficient grace for salvation.
So even if there is a universe, a world that God could make in his mind before he actuates the universe, he could actuate a universe where there's only 4 people that live on planet Earth and they all get saved. Well, isn't that preferable to creating all kinds of human beings who suffer eternally in hell? I mean, isn't this system lock in predestination? So what he basically just said was, God could create a universe where there was 4 people, and those 4 people all went to heaven, and nobody was in hell. But actually, that's not the universe God created. God created to lock in a universe where there would be all kinds of people in hell for all eternity, and that's better. This really is the quintessential system of God chose to have loved and lost rather than to have loved at all. It's better that God chose to love and have lost some than love at all. It's really spectacular. I mean, this idea that isn't that really an indictment on this system? So why didn't God just create that universe, Dr. Craig? I mean, that would have been better. You're admitting. I mean, this system does not escape the idea of predestination. This system was invented to try to get around the idea of predestination and God's divine sovereignty by Louis de Molina, if you want to study the history of it. But this system actually makes things worse, in my opinion, or at least it doesn't escape the problem. So God still chose to actuate a world in which there would be a lot of people who would go to hell and reject him, and God knew that, yet he created that universe anyway. I hope you understand that.
To every person he creates, that those who would freely repudiate God and his grace shouldn't be allowed to have some kind of veto power over which worlds God is free to create. Why should the blessedness and the eternal happiness of those who would freely respond to God and his grace be prevented by those obdurate people who would freely reject God and his every effort to save them? It seems to me that God is no less loving for preferring a world in which some people are lost despite God's every effort to save them. They have no one to blame but themselves.
Despite God's every effort to save them. That's an interesting point he's making too. So the reason God doesn't create a universe in which there's only 4 people that get saved is because he doesn't want to be controlled by, so let's say he could create a universe where only 4 people are saved, but 1 person is lost. So in other words, in Dr. Craig's system, this is the optimal balance of lost and saved that God's actually actuated. So remember, in Dr. Craig's system, if he's asked directly and he's honest, he'll say, and he said this before, there is no universe that God could create where all people would be saved. Why not? Well, because that universe is not available to God to make, because it's not feasible for God to make that universe, because there's all kinds of counterfactuals of freedom, and this is where it gets really complicated. But basically, what that means is there's this law, this principle of human free will. Remember, this system is completely more than Arminianism would ever dream of being. This system is completely built around the autonomous free will of a creature. Like the whole thing is built around it. Like the whole flaw in the system for God is that he has to make creatures that are free in a libertarian sense. And his decree and his power can have no influence directly upon the choices of free creatures. He basically has to run the simulation and see what free creatures will do. And this is the universe that has the optimal saved-lost balance of creatures to it. So in this system that we live in now, in this universe that God has actuated, the actual reality we live in, this has the maximum number of people who God could save under every possible circumstances and who would be lost. And that's what gives God glory in this system, is because, oh, look at God. He actually made a universe where the most people could be saved. Okay? And then, look, he gave everybody a choice in the scenarios he ran. And then the one he actuated, the universe he actuated, is the one we actually live in. And that has the maximal amount of saved people. I know if you're trying to track with me, I know it's very complicated. So I might get in trouble for this, and some Molinists might really freak out about I do this. But I'm going to illustrate this, the second part of the video, we're going to watch a clip from The Matrix. Now, I had an interesting experience. So those of you kids from the 90s and the early 2000s, you'll remember The Matrix. It was a cult classic hit. It was a trilogy, and it was a wildly popular movie when it came out. Now, I tried to get my kids to watch it, who are 12, 13, 14, and 16, and to my shock, they didn't like it. We got halfway through the first movie and they were like, this movie's stupid. This movie's boring. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, first of all, I'm becoming an old man. And it was one of those things where I really wanted my kids to get into The Matrix and this is going to be cool. And they hated it. So just to share that story, man. But anyway, if you've never seen The Matrix, go watch it. And if you're a millennial or younger, and you think this is a stupid movie, I don't know what to do for you. You're beyond salvation. This world that's actuated you, we're never going to like this movie. Anyway, that's a bad Molinist joke. I want to, if you're familiar with The Matrix, I think the scene where Neo meets the architect explains Molinism. So if you want a simpler way to understand Molinism, it's The Matrix. The Matrix actually shows Molinism. So remember, what is The Matrix? The Matrix this is Neo. So humans are plugged into a virtual reality machine called The Matrix, and they are stuck in it, and they are unaware that they are in The Matrix. And it is a supercomputer AI that has created a simulation where all human beings are plugged into it through the back of their skull, and they are living in a simulated reality that's created by The Matrix. But the problem is, and this is going to be the problem, Neo is a human being who has been set free from The Matrix, who has power within The Matrix to change things, and he can break the laws of the place he lives in. It's you have to watch the movie, okay? But basically, this is a very crucial part of the second movie where he actually meets the architect, who is the AI who's created The Matrix. And the architect describes what his problem is in creating The Matrix and how he is, and this is just like Molinism, the architect is not able to create a universe or matrix that is perfect. He's not able to do it. And we'll see the reason why he's unable to do it. Very much like Molinism. So let's watch this clip and I'll stop and start and explain. And then we'll be done with this edition of A Gentle Calvinist. So this is Neo entering the door that takes him into the Matrix. Now, to help you understand this, these screens right here, right, that are in, so that's the architect. Now, all these screens, so this is the AI is able to run the scenarios of every possible response Neo's going to have to this interaction. So this is middle knowledge in Molinism. All these screens are all the possible worlds that could happen. And what you'll see if you watch the scene, when Neo responds, the camera zooms into a screen, and that becomes the new reality with a bunch of screens behind it. So what the Matrix is able to do is use an AI program to try to predict every possible response, or in Molinism, every possible universe that is available. Okay? But what is going to be the problem that the architect or the AI faces? There's always free will. There's always choice. Neo can always choose something that the architect either can't predict or the architect doesn't want him to do because it will mess up the architect's overall control of the system. Okay, and to me, this really explains Molinism and what it is. So let's continue. Let's listen to the dialogue a little bit.
Hello, Neo. Who are you? I am the architect. I created the Matrix. I've been waiting for you. You have many questions, and though the process has altered your consciousness, you remain irrevocably human. Ergo, some of my answers you will understand, and some of them you will not. Concordantly, while your first question may be the most pertinent, you may or may not realize it is also the most irrelevant.
Why am I here?
Your life is the sum of a remainder of an unbalanced equation inherent to the programming of the Matrix. You are the eventuality of an anomaly which, despite my sincerest efforts, I have been unable to eliminate from what is otherwise a harmony of mathematical precision.
So this is the Molinist God. It's just creepy. So the anomaly is free will. So the architect's desire is to create a system of perfect harmony, in which, and of course, in the movie, the AI and the robots have created a power source out of human bodies, and they harvest human bodies and plug them into the system in order to get the energy to survive. And you got to watch it to see that. But this represents a God, and God's desire is to create a universe of perfection. So, of course, in Molinism, they want to salvage that, God is good. God desires all to be saved, and God wants a universe where all people are in heaven. But, that, of course, that hasn't happened. Molinists tend to not be universalists, so they would admit that people go to hell. And why do people go to hell? Well, in this system, why can't the architect create a matrix of perfection where everyone is happy and blessed and enjoying life? Well, because of free will, and he'll explain because of something inherent in human nature where humans cannot accept a universe of perfection. So Neo represents the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom and the free will that Neo brings to the table that he can't control because he doesn't have control over that. So let's continue.
While it remains a burden assiduously avoided, it is not unexpected and thus not beyond a measure of control, which has led you inexorably here.
You haven't answered my question.
Quite right. Interesting. That was quicker than the others.
How many?
So watch. So see. So now what the AI is doing is it's running every possible reaction that Neo could have to that statement. What there are others. Once again, you got to watch the whole movie to understand what's going on here. But so this is like Molinism. this supercomputer, or i.e. God, is able to run every possible world, every possible scenario in his mind to come up with the world that is actually actuated, that he wants to actuate. So watch what happens. Watch.
Matrix is older than you know. I prefer counting from the emergence of one integral anomaly to the emergence of the next, in which case this is the 6th version.
So see how it's zooming in?
Possible explanations.
This is the actuated world. Boom.
Where no one knows.
Precisely. As you are undoubtedly gathering, the anomaly is systemic, creating fluctuations in even the most simplistic equations.
You can't make me do anything like trick.
Choice. The problem is choice.
Oh, there it is. So what is the problem in Molinism, and what is the problem in that's captured in the movie? The architect cannot control choice. So choice limits the possible worlds that the architect can create. Now listen to this. So now the architect explains, the AI computer in this analogy, why he couldn't create a universe of perfection or a matrix of perfection, that is the question for Molinism, and it's the question for theology or any kind of theistic system. Why didn't God create a universe where everyone is blessed and happy and there's no evil, pain, sin, and suffering? That's the burden. It's called theodicy. It's the burden of every system that has a divine being who created a universe.
The first matrix I designed was quite naturally perfect. It was a work of art, flawless, sublime, a triumph equaled only by its monumental failure. The inevitability of its doom is apparent to me now as a consequence of the imperfection inherent in every human being. Thus I redesigned it, based on your history, to more accurately reflect the varying grotesqueries of your nature. However, I was again frustrated by failure.
So the AI, the first Matrix was perfect. It was a paradise. It was, as you could say, like the Garden of Eden. Now, was God frustrated? Because this is the explanation of the most, this is just pop evangelicalism, average churchgoers' understanding of theodicy, is that God created a universe that he wanted to be perfect, and Adam and Eve, because of some inherent flaw in them, messed up God's desire. So God wanted Adam and Eve to not fall. They fell anyway, and now we have the universe we live in. God's up in heaven, kind of sitting there like the architect going, I've been frustrated. It's a monumental failure. And I'll send Jesus as plan B to maybe mitigate the disaster and save some people. That's basically the basic understanding that people have of what's going on with the fall. Maybe let's continue.
I have since come to understand that the answer eluded me because it required a lesser mind, or perhaps a mind less bound by the parameters of perfection. Thus, the answer was stumbled upon by another, an intuitive program, initially created to investigate certain aspects of the human psyche. If I am the father of the Matrix, she would undoubtedly be its mother.
The Oracle.
Please. As I was saying, she stumbled upon a solution whereby nearly 99% of all test subjects accepted the program as long as they were given a choice, even if they were only aware of the choice at a near unconscious level. While this answer functioned, it was obviously fundamentally flawed, thus creating the otherwise contradictory systemic anomaly that, if left unchecked, might threaten the system itself. Ergo, those that refuse the program, while a minority, if unchecked, would constitute an escalating probability of disaster.
This is about Zion.
You are here because Zion is about to be destroyed. Its every living inhabitant terminated, its entire existence eradicated.
Bullshit.
Bullshit.
Denial is the most predictable of all human responses. But rest assured, this will be the 6th time we have destroyed it, and we have become exceedingly efficient at it.
Okay, so I know for some that might be a crude analogy, but I think it captures perfectly what Molinism is. So for those of you who struggle with what Molinism is and middle knowledge and what Dr. William Lane Craig and those are teaching, I think that's a great analogy. Go back and watch all the Matrix movies if you've never seen them or if you haven't seen them for many years. But I think that is the quintessential analogy for Molinism. God is like the architect who has to deal with the fact that free creatures, he cannot, that is the counterfactual in their language, or in this scene, as Neo says, the problem is choice. So the reason why God, we live in a universe where individuals are not saved and everyone isn't saved, isn't because God is working out his divine decree, isn't because God has a plan and a purpose that he's working out, that we will understand when we are in glory. But now we may not understand it, but we know that God is sovereign and he is almighty and he's working out his plan. No. God is unable to save everyone because that universe is not available for him to create because, and here's the problem with a lot of these systems, and this one it's very pronounced, because there is some law, there is some situation, there is some principle outside of God, and this is this is the issue. It exists outside of God, which that creates an instant problem. God, in the simplicity of his triune being, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, from all eternity, nothing existed before he created. So where did this principle come from? Where does this law come from? A lot of these systems are inherently dualistic. What do I mean by that? That a lot of these systems create eternal principles that, there's God, and then there's some other eternal principle that exists outside of God or beside God that he has to interact with, namely human free will. And it's just completely unacceptable from a Christian worldview. Before there was anything, there was nothing, only God. So even these principles or these circumstances, they originate from the creative act and decree of God. They are not separate from him. But in this system, according to William Lane Craig, no, there's not a possible universe available to God because he has to deal with the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. In other words, creaturely freedom restrains God from any possible universe he could create. So in Molinism, let's just be clear, they will assert there is no possible universe God could create where everyone would be saved. That is not possible for God. So talk about a denial of God's sovereignty and a denial of God's aseity. We need to do an episode on what the aseity of God means. Go ahead and look that up. But this system denies the simplicity and aseity of God. And that because it complicates it, because God has this other set of circumstances, of principles, laws of human freedom that he has to do business with. And every creation that he would want to make, he has to run through this process to see how it would turn out on the other side. How is that process not equal to God, or at least something that God has to deal with to a point where it jeopardizes the sovereignty, majesty, glory, and unity and independence of God? That's where the system really threatens. So I hope this has helped you. I don't know if it's even helped me. As I said at the beginning, I know not claim to be an expert in Molinism and to have read all the literature, but I know it does come out a lot at a popular level, so I'm trying to respond at a popular level. But anyway, so thanks for joining us today on another episode of A Gentle Calvinist. Please like and share the videos on this Facebook page and on our YouTube page, and I will appreciate it. So thank you, and God bless.